Let's get things rolling. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. We are here for our 12th and final webinar of 2024, Want to Win the War for Talent. Use these metrics to get the intel you need. This is a really important topic because measurement is something that's key and usually overlooked, but can give us so many insights into our efforts and lets us know what's working, what's not working, and what we can do about it. So let's get right into it. We'll be admitting people as they show up. And as always, this is an interactive webinar. We want people to ask questions, share their insights, so raise your hand or make a comment in the chat, or even pipe up if you want to interact with us. We're happy to take questions or dive into problems you might be experiencing, because that's how we all learn and grow. So Ed, let's get to the next slide, and we'll get things going. So first of all, what is our promise for this webinar? Well, the thing is, most businesses don't track the effectiveness of their recruitment efforts, but you can stay on top of talent acquisition by following the right metrics. And in this webinar, we've kind of pulled together our favorite metrics for recruitment and talent acquisition. And this is based on Ed's insights from the last 25 years of working in organizations from the HR perspective, and just being a numbers geek and liking to measure how well things are working. So we've discussed these extensively. So this is for you. If posting and praying has not been working, we all know that recruitment has changed a lot in the last couple of years, and just sticking a job post up kind of gets you crickets. You don't know if your recruitment efforts have been effective, and that's another thing that maybe you are getting responses, but you're not getting the right responses, or you're posting in several places, and you're getting help, you're getting the person you need. But you don't know where that person came from, or how much it cost you. And then finally, if you want to beat the competition and hire the talent you need. And that is really the emphasis of all these webinars, is how you can be the person that, or the company that is stealing talent from all the other places. Because people just know that working for you is where it's at. If you want to be that company, then listen up. These metrics are what you use to measure. So what are we going to cover in this session? Well, you're going to discover the metrics that indicate success in recruitment. So again, testing if things are working, we'll show you how to get a baseline of where your recruitment efforts stand. So if you haven't been doing anything up until this point, it doesn't matter. We can establish where we're at and then start measuring from here. And then finally, the adjustments that you must make to your recruitment strategy to win the war for talent. Because if you're measuring things, you want to be responding to the measurements. So just a quick promotion of next month's webinar. It is on January 15th at 1 p.m., and it's called Attract Top Talent and Build a Company Culture that Supercharges Growth. And that's really what we're all about, is the company culture and just being that place that people want to work. So put that on your calendar. In the new year, we want to kick it off strong and get things rolling in 2025. So why should you be listening to us? Well, I'll just introduce myself quickly. I teamed up with Ed Crow, who's the talent attraction. I'll let you talk about that after give your moniker. But anyway, I started working with Ed way back during the pandemic. When he came across me on a webinar or something, doing some storytelling with a good friend of mine who is a speaker coach, Ed thought, well, I can use some more story in my business. And so we did some great work together on his story approach and what he was telling about his business. And I thought, geez, you know what? My clients could really use this, telling the story of their companies so that they could attract more talent. And since then, we've done a number of projects together, and we've been gathering the insights from these companies and seeing just how well it's worked in terms of breaking into new industries, onboarding talent that's, at a level 30% higher than what they've been doing, and having retention. So there's a lot of things that telling the right stories can do, and that's why Ed and I are working together. I'll hand it over to Ed.
So hey everyone, I'm Ed Crow, the talent transformation expert for companies seeking 8-figure growth, and I work with companies, especially their leadership teams, on becoming more effective and putting the right strategies and processes in place to support the people initiatives. Because we all hear that people are our most important asset, but most companies don't truly approach the people strategy as an asset and as a line item on the budget. And so I help companies do that. And today's webinar is really one of the keys in how I work with my clients in establishing the measures that we use to make sure we're effective. We have so many measures in our business, from a productivity to a customer satisfaction perspective, But oftentimes we don't look at the effectiveness of all of our people processes and whether they're really giving us the bang for the buck that we need. And today, Paul and I, as he mentioned, we're going to give you some of our favorites. They're going to help you specifically on the talent, attraction, acquisition, and retention side. Great. So as Peter Drucker famously said, what gets measured gets managed, and it works with anything that we do, right? If you don't take a measurement, figure out where you are at the start and then where you're getting to, we never know if anything's happening at all. So something good to think about is you conclude 2024 and something to put on your list of goals for 2025. So let's just talk about what our favorite metrics are. Well, we chose metrics that have to do with turnover. We have a couple that are addressing compensation, and we've got total people cost. What else do we have here? Engagement and talent acquisition. So I think we have a total of maybe 5, 7 metrics. Then they fall under these categories. And I'm going to kick us off with turnover. So in turnover, what we have to address is why are people leaving? How many people are leaving? And figuring out what type of reasoning there is for it. And so before we get into the actual metrics, which Ed is going to take on, we're going to look at the resignation drivers, which look a lot like what do we call these, Ed, before talent? They are retention drivers, yeah. And to a certain extent, they are attraction drivers too, yeah. So there's two sides to each coin, right? So if you want to build an employment brand, which is the last time we talked about these, probably in the last month, we talked about all these as motivation and retention drivers, things that are assets that your company offers that have the potential to pull employees away from other companies. But if you're not doing a good job with some of these or in certain areas, they become resignation drivers. So people will leave because the benefits aren't good enough and they're getting a better offer somewhere else. The huge one that we keep harping on, is culture and work environment. If your culture is toxic, well, people will be disgruntled and they'll be looking for something better. Financial compensation can't be overlooked. That is something that if you're not competitive, people will be walking out the door. And we saw this actually firsthand with one of our clients that once they did, Ed, does the compensation reviews with people. And when people get up to the market rate, that's a baseline, right? You have to be offering what's competitive in the marketplace just to keep people, and then all the other drivers become effective. But one of our clients, as soon as they started addressing the compensation, their retention shot up and all their key people kept staying growth and earning potential. That's something that people need to see a path forward on, or they lose hope and want to go somewhere else. Management, climate, of course, and relationship with supervisor, all part of the experience of being an employee at your workplace. And then flexibility is something that we can't overlook, especially post-pandemic, when everybody has had the ability to work from home and see that they can do their jobs from there. And then finally, training and development, no matter what the climate is economically, that is one of the number one things that you can do to make sure that your company stays strong and competitive as train your employees. So these are resignation drivers again. They fit into your culture, into your retention strategy in so many ways, and we've talked about them a number of times in the past. Yeah, and I think, Paul, to some of the comments that you made, we can put measures on all of this, and we are going to talk specifically about COMPA in a little bit here, and some measures for that. But certainly you can do, whether it's informal polling in your workplace or more formal focus groups around what's going well in your culture and your work environment, what the climate's like with management and relationship with the supervisor. These are things that HR can absolutely measure, but often doesn't. And one of the things that I hear, when especially around the culture perspective, is they'll say, how do you measure culture? Well, the people that ask me that typically don't have a defined culture.
If we can define your culture for what it is, then we can measure our activities against it. And so we've got to be careful that we have a defined culture so that we can turn around and measure it, right? And training and development. I mean, a lot of people say, well, we want training. Okay, great. But why? What's that doing for us? Right? Are we giving people the training that they need and want, or are we just doing all the compliance stuff like harassment and discrimination and, safety, those kind of things? And I don't mean to downplay them. They're important, obviously. But training and development, the key word there I see is development, right? And Paul, you mentioned it. If people don't see that they've got the path forward in terms of their growth, and they get that through their personal development on the job, then they feel they're in a dead-end job and they'll leave exactly, so no problem. Now, a lot of the metrics that we have our numbers and figures very measurable in terms of, costs or number of people or time, like something that a concrete number. But some of the things that are abstract, like culture or employee sentiment and satisfaction, those are the things that you do need to survey people for. And sometimes, we just were afraid to ask, or it's a hard subject to sort of broach. And the thing is, if you want to grow, you have to go there. It's just something. It's a relationship. And in relationships, if you don't go into the hard places, you don't get past them. They become those elephants in the room, and they grow and grow until somebody ends up leaving. So that's really key. So in terms of the retention drivers, one thing that is really important is to find out, why do people leave? Like if they are leaving your workforce in droves or whatever. Like, are you having a good employee exit interview, and are you asking about all the different reasons they were dissatisfied, or what? What did they get that's better? What better offer did they get? So that you can learn from that and make changes. Now, we prefer that you're asking these questions before people are leaving, so that you're keeping your finger on the pulse of their satisfaction, what employees want, and how you can make that culture better. And we're really big on naming your culture, defining it and saying, what is it that makes us great? And making sure it's aligned with your company values so that you're actually delivering an experience that you can take ownership of and feel proud of. And a lot of places just, they say, yeah, things are good here, or people like it, or, yeah, we struggle with that, or things are getting a little toxic, but they don't have something set and defined as, this is us, and this is how we want to be, and this is what we will do to stay ourselves and stay great. This is something that we really emphasize, and we'll go in and if you're saying your culture is this, we'll actually go and check and make sure that, yeah, your people actually say that. And so when it comes to doing focus groups or interviewing employees, you can gain a wealth of insights. And what people tell Ed and I when we step in versus what they say to HR or say to their supervisors is very different, right? Because they'll be a lot more open with somebody when they know that, they're not being evaluated. They don't have the eye of the people above them looking down, and they're not trying to impress them. So we get a lot of insights, and in many cases, the people we've worked for have been shocked and surprised by, oh, good that people think they have it. If the culture is good and if it's bad, you know, the things that people are dissatisfied with, it's usually surprising and not what you think. So getting that external perspective is important, but in terms of why employees leave and doing a great exit interview, we have an exit interview form that Ed has used with a number of clients. And if you want that at the end of the webinar, when you scan the QR code, you'll have the opportunity to get that.
And I'll tell you, Paul, there's two schools of thought too on exit interviews. You know, some folks say, oh, you got to do them like on their last day and do them live and sit down with HR. I'm beginning to see a trend where folks are sending out the exit interview post-termination of employment, via an email or whatever, and they've let the former employee know, hey, we're going to send this interview out. Would you be willing to do it for us? Now, the downside of that is you're not going to get as many responses as if you have someone sit down with you. But what we're finding is that the responses we're getting are more open. So, I think it depends on the relationship that you have with your employees, and especially the relationship that the exit interviewer has with the employee who's leaving. That would help you to determine whether you want to do it live or send out, a form later and play with it, though, and see what you get. Because you may find that, once folks are actually physically out of your workplace and they definitely got nothing to lose, they may be a little more open with you than sitting across a desk. So here's the thing, with turnover costs, there's a lot of different ways to calculate it, and you can, certainly Google these things. But one of the things that I like to look at is I want to know when we think about who is leaving, I look at that in a couple of different scenarios. So am I losing top talent? And you have to have a definition for what top talent means to you, okay? And you know what ratio of the people that you would classify as top talent are leaving? And can you put a cost on that? In other words, it's not the same if I'm on the top talent list and I leave the cost of that to the company is greater than if Paul's a new hire who has not yet proven himself. and he turns over. Not that there's not a cost to that, because we've invested in Paul to get him in, right? But you see that there is definitely a difference in where I'm at. And so how we calculate turnover cost, I think, has to be very specific to the level of the individual. So you might look at things like, well, how long is it going to take to fill Ed's job as a more perhaps seasoned employee than Paul's position as a more, a newer, perhaps an entry level position right there. There's going to be different costs associated with filling those gaps. What's the cost to us to have that seat vacant? Those are going to be very different as well. And so I'm not a big fan of applying the same turnover cost metric to everyone in your organization. It's an easy way to do it. It'll give you a ballpark figure, but if you really want an eye-opener, you want to go after it very specifically by position, and you can get as into the weeds as you want here, you could keep it as general as well. If Ed was making $50,000 a year, that equates to X dollars per hour. And so for every hour that that seat's empty, it's costing us whatever that total sum is, right? But the sum is more than that, because if my work's not getting done, it's loading onto other people, which could be causing overtime, could be causing burnout issues. And so again, you could really get into the weeds on this one to show how extensive the money spent is at your company by having turnover over a certain percentage. And again, knowing that some turnover is good is also important. If you tell me, well, gosh, Ed, our turnover is only 2%, we're happy with that. Okay, good. But who is the 2% that's leaving, right? If you're upskilling that 2% because your bottom performers are the ones leaving, great, that's it. That's good turnover. If that 2% is comprised of all of your top performers, that's a whole nother problem. So you want to make sure that you're calculating these costs in a way that makes sense for the positions, the level in the organization that these people are turning over from. So I'm going to keep rolling here with comp. Again, there's so many different ways to look at comp. One of the most common ways is to look at it as a percentage of your overall budget. And for a lot of companies, that's going to come in at maybe around a third of the budget is something related to compensating our people. So it is a big ticket item. And in organizations that are far more service driven, that maybe don't have a lot of overhead costs and equipment costs, that percentage could even be much higher, perhaps. But I'll tell you, the one thing that I like to look at for COVID is something called copper ratio. And all this does is this compares where a person's salary is compared to the midpoint of their salary band. So again, to give you an example, let's say the salary band is 50,000 to 100,000. Well, the midpoint of that would be 75,000. So if Paul was making 80,000, he's going to have a 1 point something copper ratio. And because there's the 1 there, that tells me he's a little over the midpoint. It's not a problem, just tells me where he is. Now, let's say he's making 70,000, his comp ratio is going to be 0.9 something, right? So that tells me he's just a little bit below the midpoint. Now, what do we do with all this? Well, when I start to look at where all of my people fall, I can get a really good idea of whether we are paying people as close to the middle of the pay band as possible. And the reason that's important is that I believe, and when I work with clients on comp, that midpoint of the pay band is generally about the average in the marketplace. So I want to make sure that to the extent that Paul is a proven employee who's getting good performance reviews and he's getting me the results, I got to make sure he's at least at his salary midpoint. Otherwise, he's likely a candidate for turnover. As we mentioned, comp and benefits are big pieces in there. And if he doesn't feel like he's being rewarded well enough, that may get him to start passively looking or being open to a headhunter's call or something along those lines. And so just making sure that from a comp standpoint, he is where I would expect him to be based on the market and based on how we internally manage our compensation. Compa ratio is the way to make that happen for us. Now, total people cost, this is another biggie. It's probably the most complex one to calculate that we're going to present to you today. And I'm going to list out here just a couple of the things that go into calculating total people costs. So first, obviously, is pay. What are we paying people? Okay, how much are we spending on recruiting? So that includes not only the cost of websites and job ads and those kinds of things, but the cost of our recruiting function. Their salaries go into here. And if you're a one-person HR function, okay, then you look at the percentage of time that you spend on recruitment, you take that percentage of your salary, and that becomes part of the total people cost. Okay, what is it costing us to onboard people in terms of the training time that they're in there, the time of anyone that we've got coming in to speak as a part of the onboarding process? If you've got a formalized one where, say, all the new recruits come in on Monday and they get a week in a classroom kind of thing, well, what's the cost of the classroom? What's the cost of the time of the people who are coming in, giving the different lessons? And so all that would get thrown in there. Then you've got the ongoing training after that, any training that we're doing again, whether that's compliance or whether that's development training, we would throw in there, along with the cost of training materials, the trainers, time and again, the classroom, all of that we really want. The holistic picture, we're going to grab all of that to the extent that we can. What about retirement benefits? This would be like your 401k match. If you're an old blue chip company, you still got a pension rolling around. What are your pension benefits? What about your Social Security insurance payments on behalf of those folks? Okay, so anything related to retirement would be in there. And then what other costs might be in there? You certainly would want to throw the cost of any type of benefits that the company is paying for in there. Maybe your company is seeding people's flexible spending accounts with some money. You'd want to get that in there, right? Gosh, really, you could think of that. You could even assign things like, oh, I needed an accommodation at my desk. I needed a special chair for a disability. Okay, well, that would be a total people cost, right? So this can get pretty complex, but you can see the power in it, that this goes far beyond just saying, well, people are 30% of our budget. You start to throw in all of these things and we'll start to see pretty quickly that people are at minimum 30% and could be perhaps much, much higher in terms of their total cost of the company. Now, the thing is, what do we do with this? Why is this such an important metric? I had an organization that came to me because they were finding that they were not competitive in bidding for work. So this was a manufacturer that served as a subcontractor, and they had their little niche of what they did for folks. And they said, we're not quite sure why. We think it's something related to our people. And when I dug into it, I found that they had next to no turnout. People had worked there 2030, some cases, 40 years and on. Sort of say, oh, that's really cool. That's great. Yeah, I mean that they had a nice place to work. The problem was they kept giving pay bump after pay bump after pay bump with no correlation back to what the market was paying. And my analysis showed just the pay alone, on average, was 20% above the market. It's really tough to compete when you are overpaying your people like that, because they were in a place where they could no longer pass 20% premiums onto the customer for the making of the widgets, right? They were literally pricing themselves out of business based on their pay. So that's one of the reasons why it's so critical to know what our total people cost is as a function of the rest of our business. And if you have a business that's high tech and requires a lot of fancy gadgets, okay, that's going to be a major investment. If you're a company that has a lot of physical buildings because of the nature of your work, that's going to be another type of cost. And you can start to relate these costs to one another and see if, in fact, one cost is outpacing the other in not a good way. So total people cost, well, it'll cost you some time to calculate, but if you can get it down even close to some of the things that I've just mentioned, it'll be an eye-opener for those not just in HR, but for those of you that are in HR and you're trying to get, whether it's money expended or trying to get that seat at the table as a more strategic player, this is the kind of thing that's going to get you that seat at the table. So Paul, I'm going to throw it back to you to talk about engagement. And I love the metric you're going to talk about here.
Yeah. And I love engagement and just like how happy people are at work and how engaged they are because, you can have great employees, like people that do their job really well, but at the same time, they're just not engaged. They do their job because that's part of their work ethic, who they are, but they don't believe in what you stand for. Or they're doing their job because it's their work ethic, but they don't support what the company does or the management, and they wouldn't advise anybody to work there. And these are really important things to know because if that's what's going on inside, an employee on the outside, might look like everything's fine. But if you don't do any digging and ask questions, you won't find this out. And I know you've come across this in a number of different ways. Ed, in your experience, in the term presenteeism, right? Like people show up, they're doing their job, but they're, doing the minimum to get by. And it's typically because they're either burnt out Or, as you said, they're not seeing the company's vision and buying into it. There just isn't room for that anymore. And I think, in the past we could get away with just, park your feelings at the door, show up, do your job, and you're lucky to be getting this job and you'd be getting paid what you are. So suck it up and be happy. And that works. But now it just doesn't work anymore because our new generations and actually everybody is just asking for more. And they should, right? Because it's such a big part of our lives. And with quality of life going up, we really have to be considering what we're providing our employees as a place to work. And this all plays into what we've been preaching all year in terms of the employment brand. Like, if you're not a great place to work, forget about stealing talent from the bigger players in the marketplace. People will be leaving to go somewhere nicer to work than where you're at. So engagement is a big one. And this metric it's kind of, well, it puts a number on things that aren't really tangible. And so the Net Promoter Score, this is a measure of just how much people will promote you as a great place to work. And what we're really interested in is those two green smiles at the end there, the promoters numbers 9 and 10, the people who will just go on and on touting your virtues and just saying that this is the best place on the planet. I want all my friends in here. Everybody that I know and care about should be here because it's so good here. And they will go and sell your company. Everything you do, they just talk about you all the time. And that's what you want. And then really underneath that, all the numbers from 8 all the way down to 0, those are things that you want to address. You want to make sure that you're moving people into the promoter score. So I'll give you a little, this is something that you're assigning. These are scores you're assigning to your employees based on your own insight. Maybe interviews that you've had with your employees, reviews, and just gaining their sentiment. And then at the end of those interviews, you just do a little gut check and then see where would that person fall. Are they going to be in the 9 and 10 category or do they fall into the passives category? So if we look at the promoters at 9 and 10, they're highly engaged. They're really loyal. And things that they would say is, I love working here. I definitely recommend it to my friends. Those are the things that you would hear. And then what you need to do is you want to keep them happy. You want to recognize their commitment and reward them. So that's how you manage those. But then when you get down to 7 and 8, you're looking at ASV. These are people that they're coming to work and things are good. They're happy enough. Like they don't really have anything to say about it. So generally they're satisfied, but they're not enthusiastic. And, they'll say something like, it's okay, it's not amazing, but it's a job. And what we want to do is create opportunities for them to become more engaged, get more buy-in to what we're about. Because that's what makes a really great team is when everybody is going to do anything to uphold the vision and they'll go the extra mile. And they want everybody to succeed. So when you get to the passives, that's where you've got the presenteeism starting to kick in. And, even people there could be quiet quitting. They're sitting there, they're doing their job to get paid, but they aren't going to do one little bit more. And so those people you can hopefully be bumping them up to numbers like this way to number 9 and 10. But if they're falling lower and you're getting into the 5 and 6 area, those people are mild detractors. They're not just passive and not engaged. They're starting to take away from your culture. And again, what we said is you want to define that culture of yours. You want to protect the culture, so you want to be looking for anything that could be chipping away at the experience of other employees that are really happy. They're trying to erode the environment and they want to sour everything. So you got to watch out. So when people are starting to be detractors, well, the danger is that, they're not really unhappy. It's not good. It's not bad. They're just, they're kind of meh. And how many people do we see at work that are just like, how are you doing? Like, same old, same old. Like, there probably are a lot of mild detractors in any given workplace, and we've got to stay on top of those. And what we want to be doing is, at that point, investigating, having conversations with them, and finding out what the pain points are. What is it that is making you so complacent? And what would make you happy? Is there anything that make you happy? And is this the right place, for you to seek happiness? And in reality, we want to look at how we can address the factors that are making them dissatisfied, because it could show you undercurrents that are affecting everybody. And that, some people, because they're happy about a lot of other things, aren't really too affected by these things. So you want to make sure that you're finding out about things before they become really strong currents pulling people under. Now, and we move down to the to numbers 3 and 4. We're looking at strong detractors. Now these people are actively trying to pull people down. And now they're disengaged. They might not be that vocal about it, but they're really disengaged. And they'll be saying things like, "Well, there's a lot of issues here and nobody cares like that. Nobody does anything about these," I tell people, and nothing gets solved. And so these people are probably complaining to everybody else around them and being quite, they're talking and they're voicing their concerns. They just don't necessarily try and, sabotage everything. So what you want to do with these people is identify systemic problems you want to see. Like what? What is it, What are these major problems in the organization? And are they being noticed across the board? Or is it just this person? When you get down to 0 and 1, these are strong detractors, and they're highly disengaged, and they have a major dissatisfaction. They'd say things like, "I'll never recommend this place." And at this point, you've got some major grievances, and an intervention is probably necessary. So all these scores, you want to be assigning them at a time of review and then get a whole net promoter score. So what you do is you take all the promoters and you divide them by the number of detractors. I think it is. Is there a O, right? So net promoter score is percent of promoters minus all the detractors, and that gives you a score. And ultimately, I can't remember what the number was. I mean, obviously it's just a case where or higher is better. The more promoters you have, the better off. I mean, if, let's say you have to make it easy, a 10-person workforce, and this was your ratings right here, of all of your people, you know, you'd have a net promoter score of minus 62,467, minus no. Sorry, minus 5, right? Because you would have 7 detractors minus from 2 promoters. You have a minus 5 score. That's really bad, because notice the passives have no impact one way or the other. And so even though Paul identified like 5 and 6 and 4 and 3 and so on, they're still all detractors. We can't say, oh, well, they're not as bad. Yet, they're still detractors. So we still take them off. So to the extent that we can have a positive net promoter score, the better our culture is really what it comes down to. And so, the first time you do it, I would be willing to bet, if you're honest, you're going to have probably a negative score initially, unless you've got an amazing culture, and that's okay. It gives us something to work towards good. So that's it on culture and engagement, and now we'll move into talent acquisition, Ed.
Yeah, talent acquisition, Paul. I mean, we've been talking about this all year, right? Like, all the ways to do it, the ways not to do it, and how to attract top talent. And so what you have to ask yourself is, are my results what I need? Well, that's a big question when you say that. Because if you tell me, well, yeah, I had 10 openings this year. I filled all 10 openings. Okay, great. That's one way to look at it. But the broader way to look at it is, who are you filling those jobs with? Are we filling seats or are we attracting top talent? So when we think about talent acquisition, let's think about it in a couple of ways. I keep bumping the wrong button. And so one of the ways we can look at this is the revenue loss due to a position being vacant. A lot of companies will measure how long a position has been open, and we'll hear those stories. Paul, I mean, we hear them all the time. I've got a position that's been open 6 months. I think we had one, it was 17 months or something like that. And that's okay if you just can't find the right person and you're holding out for the right person. But that's also costing you money. And again, as I mentioned earlier, when we look at the loss due to the position being vacant, that revenue loss is going to be different based on the job, right? So let's say you have an entry-level stock clerk who's making, $15 an hour. Okay, well, that's one cost. If you have an open CFO role, that's a whole different cost. And so again, not saying that one position is more important than the other, but in looking at what it's costing us to have those positions open is key, because that helps us to focus on which positions do we need full attention to get filled, because they're costing the company a lot of money. And when we think about this, it's not just in terms of, oh, well, it's just a $15 order picker. Okay, well, there's probably some other dollars of revenue getting lost there. If my other order pickers are having to pick up the slack and they're starting to make mistakes shipping our customers wrong product, defective products, those kinds of things. All of those things cost us money and potentially cost us revenue as well. And so it's much different. We have, say, a sales position open whose sole responsibility is driving revenue, and say your accounts payable clerk whose, job it is to pay the bills kind of thing, right? Those are two very different positions, again, in terms of who's generating revenue. And so this is a great way to look at things, especially if you have a hiring team or a hiring manager who's dragging their feet on getting a position filled for whatever reason. And one of the things that I'll hear a lot of is, oh, well, we're saving money by not paying that salary. Yeah, you are, but the flip side is the revenue loss too. And if we're losing more revenue than we are in saving on that person's salary not being paid, then we have a problem. One of the other things that we can look at with talent acquisition is something called a new hire failure rate. And I use just a 90-day failure here. Maybe you find that it's better to measure at 6 months or 2 months or whatever. That's fine. You can use whatever timeline you like here, okay? But the ratio is pretty simple. So your 90-day failure rate is a simple calculation of you have the people who leave after they've been there less than 90 days divided by your total new hires in that same period. Multiply that out by 100 and you're going to get a percentage rate. So again, just to keep it simple, right? Paul and I are both hired the same day. At day 30, I leave and he stays. We get to the 90-day rate. Paul is still there. We've been the only two hired, right? What's your rate? Well, I left after less than 90 days, but Paul was still there, so there was two. Well, that's half divided by 100. It's a 50% failure rate. Okay, so obviously, the higher this number is, the worse it is. But it's telling you that something is going on in a couple of key areas: the attraction of the right talent, the interview and screening process, and/or the training and onboarding process. So the higher that 90-day failure rate is, the more I've got to look at those three areas to determine, why is my failure rate so high? Why are people getting in here and finding out that this isn't for them? So an example, back in my early days of HR, when I was at UPS and you'd be hiring for the night shift, it's a tough shift. You get someone to show up at 3 in the morning and work a very physical job unloading trucks for 4 to 5 hours at a clip. In the wintertime, it's cold in those trucks. In the summertime, it's hot in those trucks. I mean, it's not a pleasant job. And we knew that we used a 90-day rate because we knew if we could get someone to stay for 90 days, they were likely good for a year or two, okay? And given that the vast majority of our part-time workforce were college kids, if we got a year or two out of them before they graduate and moved on, we were very happy with that. So one of the things we started to do was first off interview during the actual shift. So if you were going to work at 3 a.m., I had interviews at 4 a.m. I wanted to see if you were coherent at 4 a.m. Could you get out of bed, even make it to the interview on time? The next thing that we did is we gave them a tour of the facility in the work again during the shift. So if you did a good job through your interview next week, I scheduled you for a tour of the facility. We do it at 4 a.m. We'd walk you around and show you like, hey, it's hot in here. It's middle of summer, and look what these people are doing. They're soaked with sweat, and that really gave people a great job. Preview, you contrast that with a lot of companies that I hear, they'll say, oh gosh, yeah, we don't want them to see that stuff because it gets them scared. Well, yeah, and then they leave after you hire them. So what kind of sense does that make, right? I would rather, and I had it plenty of times, people would say, Ed, after looking at this job is just not for me. Great, great. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate your honesty. I wish you all the best, right? Because that's going to help us. Some people would say, oh, but now that seat's still empty. Yeah, but what's worse, filling the seat, spending the money on the training, and then the person leaves in 30 days, right? So I like looking at this failure rate and then digging deeper to figure out, why is the rate what it is? And if I can solve those problems, that's how I fix my failure rate. But it can also be looked at in terms of, let's see where the people are coming from. So let's say, again, if we go back to me and Paul, let's say Paul was a referral from a local career placement company at a college, and HR has had great success with them before. Now they've sent us Paul, and he's another great person, and he makes it through. And I came from an ad running the newspaper. Okay, well, let's look at all the people that responded to the ad in the newspaper. Did any of them make it through? If not, then we've identified that maybe the newspaper is not where we want to be advertising. Maybe we want to put more effort into the career placement departments at various colleges, like where Paul came from, because clearly there's a different type of candidate coming out of those. So there's so much that we can glean once we have data to look at to say, that's telling me there's a problem, wonder why, and then say, okay, well, now let's start digging a little bit. Paul, anything you want to throw in there before we move on, the example of make the calculation super clear. So we promised you that we were going to give you something. We always like to give stuff away, right? Paul and I give stuff away all the time. So if you're interested in our download on hiring costs, this worksheet is going to make calculating some of the things that we talked about today. So easy things like total people costs, or your cost by referral source or recruiting source. You can apply this spreadsheet in a lot of different ways, and we are giving it to you just for spending some time with us this afternoon. So in order to get that, all you have to do is please go and get your phones out, scan the QR code here, answer a couple questions about the seminar today, whether you liked it, didn't like it, what you liked. We'd love to get your feedback, and we'll email you this hiring cost sheet, no strings attached. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to go ahead and do that, Paul. You want to share any thoughts on things maybe we didn't quite cover? I know it's been a quiet crowd today, so nothing going on in the chat just yet, but this is a little bit more of a technical presentation than some of our other ones. I just know that in the past, when we've done this, you said that if you were if you were running an HR department, that these would be the metrics that you'd want to use to make sure everything's working well. And how does this round everything out for people? Yeah, I think we can get bogged down with data sometimes, and certainly with all the power that AI is now bringing to the table, we can get data fatigue. And so for me, these that we've talked about are the ones for me that are key. And yeah, you said at the beginning, I'm a bit of a data geek. I'm a bit of a numbers guy. And so I like to base decisions on facts data. And what's the old saying that either data or stats don't lie? It's statisticians that do. Right numbers tell a story if we're willing to dig to get the numbers. And it allows us to see the story for what it is and then alter the outcome of the story. But if we don't ever sit back and calculate some of the costs that we've talked about or run some of the numbers that we've talked about, then we never really know what's going on. And I'll share one last story for our folks as they're finishing up. Here, I had a client that had terrible turnover on their second shift, and it was impacting some other areas of their business. And I asked them if they had ever looked into what was going on there, and they said, well, no, not really. Well, you've got pretty good retention everywhere else. Why is second shift so bad? So I asked him to send me some numbers, and I started playing with some data. Here was the problem. Not only was second shift a problem, the vast majority of people that were leaving on second shift never made it 6 months and were predominantly African American. Now that paints things in a whole different light. It's one thing to say, oh, I've got X% turnover on my second shift. It's another to say, oh, 80% of my turnover is represented by the African American population. Now, to me, that was a red flag. Something was going on second shift that had a whole segment of the population saying we are not going to hang out here. And I went back to the client, said, take a look at these numbers. And their eyes popped. And I was sad for that because I'm thinking, how would you not know that? How could you not see that you're hiring in a diverse workforce? And yet one part of the community was just going out the back door really fast. And so, sure enough, we found, unfortunately, there was a supervisor there saying and acting in a way towards that population that was making them say, we don't want parts of this place, right? Once we exited that supervisor, quite honestly, once we solved that problem, we started. It took a long time, though, because what was starting to happen is African Americans were not coming in to apply anymore. Either word was getting out, right? And so without the data or without the interest in checking the data, that company was really kind of just throwing their hands like, we don't know what's going on second shift, but the data told a story. So I think we can probably move on. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so Paul and I would love to thank you for hanging out with us again this year. I know some of you have come to every single month and laughed along with us and asked questions along with us. And before I wrap up, Paul, do you have any final words of wisdom for the gang?
I mean, having done this a couple of times now, I just like to see how everything points right back to that employment brand and how people perceive you out in the job market. Like what's the word on the street about what your company is like? And if you can get a measurement on that with these metrics, it gives you a way to improve. And such a good thing to do at this time of year. Kind of take an inventory of 2024 and set some new goals for 2025.
Yeah, I know it's a busy time of year for a lot of HR folks. It's open enrollment for many of you. I understand that. And so if you can't set look at your 24 metrics just yet, set a goal to do it in January, to take that look back so you can plan for 2025. I'd rather see you delay your plan a little bit into the year rather than not look back at 24 at all. And that's really the message that we've got here, is to take a look at the year, take a look start off with just a couple of these things, put them in place, and see the story that they tell for you. So thanks again for joining us. We'll see you in the new year with a brand new webinar, new content on January 15th. So take care, everyone. We'll see you soon.